Today we are going to be looking at all of the Overwatch MVPs, briefly going over why they won, and ranking them all worst to best. Nothing outside of Overwatch League will count, so if they did any other tournament or won World Cup, that does not mean anything here. So surely this will be a hoot. Our first MVP from the 2018 inaugural season is JJoNak, with the runners-up being Fissure and Carpe. JJoNak is one of the few players who was picked up because of his ranked domination, going right to NYXL. These performances translated perfectly into Overwatch League. The amount of value he was getting day by day on Zen was eye-opening, to say the least. He would put out DPS level performances consistently to the point NYXL protected the hell out of him to make sure he got value. Now, of course, people do argue he only got as much value as he did because his team pocketed him so much and played around him, but you can also say on the opposite side of the spectrum, NYXL played around him so much because of how good he was. It's an actual monkey argument, but that's just the style this team had. Protect the president and just make sure he kills everyone. Whether you praise that style or downplay the value of it for JJoNak individually and say he wouldn't be as good without it, doing that worked out for them. JJoNak Zen was unbelievably good mechanically, and some people say it's the highest peak of Zen in Overwatch history, which is reasonable. And obviously JJoNak wasn't just hard-pocketed 24/7, there were plenty of moments where he would just pop off on his own. These performances right here were being done regularly, almost 25% of his team's damage, a literal turret that mowed everyone down. JJoNak had a mechanical gift no one could compete with apparently. Not a single Zen in 2018 competed with him. He was so far ahead of everybody. NYXL finished the season 34-6, 2018's only team with above 30 wins, acquiring 2 stage titles, coming second in stage 1. This team was just incredibly dominant, and people attribute JJoNak as a massive reason to why. Also, this team just had stupidly good players on it for the time, so mixing the best flex support in the world with a really good roster, you have some guaranteed success. As the season started to close out, most people sort of knew JJoNak would be the MVP, blowing past Fissure and Carpe. With everything JJoNak did in 2018, he really deserved it. Whether you think it's from him being heavily pocketed or not, he was farming and got the results. Even when he played Ana, it was fantastic. Obviously not as good as his Zen, but he was good at everything asked of him. Sadly, NYXL did not win Grand Finals, they only got 4th, which is kind of disappointing. Not Atlanta Reign 2023 levels of disappointing, but considering their success all year, people hoped they would win. But at least the memories of JJoNak Zen live on, and we got one of the best skins in Overwatch from him winning MVP. I bought this shit right when I saw it. It's an absolutely wonderful skin. The 2019 MVP is of course Sinatraa, who played on the San Francisco Shock, even during their 2018 dogshit year, but neither him or Super were of age for parts of 2018, so they weren't at full power. Going into 2019 with GOATs is where Sinatraa truly made a name for himself, adding on to the promise from previous hype. Sinatraa was the Shock Zarya player, and he would put out insane levels of performances, gapping practically everyone on Zarya. There were a few other amazing Zaryas, of course, like Nene and Somansu, but Sinatraa seemed to be the most consistent number 1. I mean, who could forget the 2 grabs in under a minute clip? Shock was fantastic at GOATs, but Sinatra's Zarya elevated them even further, playing it to near perfection every match. They went to the Stage 1 finals, having that golden Stage 2, not losing a single map until stage playoffs, and almost winning Stage 3. It appeared Sinatraa was another one of those players where if you invested resources into him, he would carry the game for you, which clearly worked with his Zarya and Doom later on. Similar to JJoNak, if you have a player who has the capabilities to win for you, and they are surrounded by a top tier roster, on top of investing resources into said person, it's going to accelerate the effectiveness even more. During Stage 4, we actually saw Sinatraa play DPS, where I'm not gonna lie, it's not the greatest play I've seen in my entire life. After 2-2-2, he played bits of Mei and a few other heroes. It was good, obviously, but in comparison to his Zarya value, it just paled. he was just alright at the other heroes. There were just better performing players in that regard, and some of them were on his team. Until he played Doom, where it looked outstanding, honestly one of the best when he became meta for the year's end. I wonder how Sinatraa would have performed if this entire year was just him playing DPS instead of us having GOATs for so long. The MVP ballot finals for 2019 was Super, Sinatraa, Gushue, Janu, and Twilight, where I think most assumed Super or Sinatraa would be the ones to take it over the rest, which obviously Sinatraa became 2019's MVP. I do think it was deserved over the others because of how prevalent GOATs was during this year. It lasted from stage 1 to stage 3, and his Zarya play helped the Shock so much throughout the season. If Shock did not have Sinatraa Zarya, it would have been a noticeable blow to this team. The skin we got was kind of ass, I'm not gonna lie. Zarya in general has a pretty shit set of skins, unfortunately. An alien with a tuxedo just doesn't really mix. I don't know, maybe you like it. It's just pretty shit to me. And obviously the skin will never be re-released because of the whole situation surrounding Sinatraa. Regardless of your opinions on that or him as a person, Sinatraa did exist in 2019 and he was the MVP, so he needs to be talked about. 2020's MVP was Fleta, which is a more interesting conversation since this was the first MVP who got it due to flexibility rather than being locked into one or two heroes. Where Sinatraa primarily played Zarya and Jonak primarily played Zen, Fleta showcased so many heroes throughout the 2020 season and was endlessly praised for how consistent his performances were across them all, whether it was flex DPS or hit scan. I've always loved Fleta, and I'm honored to be called the fraud for putting him above Striker as a top 5 tracer. As long as someone got angry about it, I'm happy. I just love Fleta's tracer play. His Echo in 2020 was also fantastic, being one of the players who showed the potential of her kit. He whipped out the hit scan occasionally, having that famous headshot after headshot clip. Fleta played Mei when it was needed, Genji, Cassidy, Torb, literally anything that was needed, he could be there and get consistently high value with it, even though he was not mechanically the best across them all. Fleta is a really unique player to examine since he would get similar value to the Strikers and Kevsters with how he played the game, but seemingly not require many resources in comparison to most of the other MVPs or best players in 2020. He always played very reactive instead of running people down, which did get him a lot of success on the Dragons. But even though I love Fleta, I will be real, his MVP is the weakest up to this point. 2020 was the time where players started to really level up their game, creating harder MVP choices. I mean, like Choi Hyobin and Void were unreal at Sigma in 2020 and integral to their respective team's success. This was also Violet's big breakout year to be one of the best players in the world. There were plenty of arguments for other people to win MVP over Fleta. It really depends on the stance of how you feel an MVP should be chosen. Some see MVP as just the best player overall with their flexibility, even if they aren't the best player in the world. Filling in the gaps in a game where mastering so many heroes at this level can be quite difficult, or if you're someone who thinks a player deserves MVP from having the highest peak, even if they only played a select 2 or 3 heroes. Obviously, it's ideal they're insane at everything, but that's not realistic for the most part, especially in the earlier days of Overwatch. Most players have weaknesses somewhere. Fleta fell into the category of insane flexibility in 2020, and that's obviously not saying he wasn't top tier at any hero. Tracer and Echo were his two big ones, but him being so flexible is why his MVP got pushed. Up to this point in 2020, Hyperflex players were very, very rare. There are some who call him a fraud MVP, which is a bit of a stretch. He definitely deserved to win. He added a lot of value to the Dragons, maybe not as much as Void, for example, which is who I think should have won MVP this season, but saying Fleta didn't deserve it is wrong. At least him winning MVP gave us one of the best skins in Overwatch. The Good and Evil Echo skin is one of my favorites, so big ups to you, Fleta, for winning so I can have this. Our 2021 MVP was Leave, who is the best Chinese DPS player of all time. In 2020, he was a good player, but 2021, he became what we know him as now. Leave is a fucking beast, and you can honestly just leave it at that. But there is one narrative that is overblown, and the thing that pushed his MVP campaign even further, which is obviously not to say he didn't deserve it because he 100% did, but that whole Chengdu 2021 being a garbage can team and Leave as the only good player carrying 5 other recessive gene mongoloids is a trap a lot of people fell into. As you watch more of these matches back, this team was not shit. Leave, of course, elevated them to a whole new level. That is a more fair statement. If he was not here, the chances of Chengdu making 2 tournament finals would be much less, but when you get Jinmu on Pharah and Leave on literally anything, you would be fine. 2021 was the year we started seeing the true best DPS players not just be insane at 2, maybe 3 heroes, or just being flexible. They mixed the Fleta flexibility, Jonak Zen big dick energy, and Sinatra power all into one person. Leave was great at hit scan, Tracer, Genji, Echo, Hanzo, whatever you need, he could do it better than most. Having consistently high-level performances across the board, he had moments of pulling Chengdu out of the gutter, plenty of fights where he'd solo carry the team, demanding the resources of course, but no sane human would think like, oh, let's not give Leave resources if he's on our team. He was the Chinese secret weapon. The runner-up MVP behind Leave was Lip, where you could argue Lip should have won it. Both of these players are unbelievably good, but Leave had less to work with in the DPS department. I mean, he had Jinmu, Jimmy, Kaneki, and Taro Cookie in his DPS rotation. This was before Jimmy was a good hit scan, and the others just had weird hero pools Leave needed to play around. He couldn't always do what he was comfortable with because there are certain heroes his teammates just couldn't play, and Leave had to do it, which was actually beneficial for viewers since we could see Leave as top tier at everything. He did a fantastic job filling in the gaps, being one of the best players in the world, and still is in 2024. Leave's MVP is essentially the last 3 MVPs mixed together, offering the best from all of their worlds, hyper flexibility while also being arguably the best in the league at most of the heroes he played. Sadly, we didn't get an MVP skin after the Fleta one. They stopped doing it for obvious reasons. I do believe there was a rumor going around Leave would have wanted a Widow skin, but sadly we never got to see it. The MVP for 2022 was Proper, being a very hyped up player. Avril was yelling his name from the rooftops, saying he is God's gift to Overwatch, and when he joined San Francisco Shock, he kind of was, actually exceeding the God's gift part. I don't really think viewers, coaches, or even his teammates understood what was going on here. The stuff Proper was doing to other teams was something not even Leave was doing on Chengdu, and not even what Jonak with that whole protect the president shit was doing to anyone else on NYXL. When someone can make a 10-minute compilation of Proper getting 4 to 5Ks after 1 league season, shows you what Proper was capable of. He was talked about non-stop, which did create a reverse narrative for him. Instead of people being awed at Proper, viewers started to get sick of him, even to the point of finding ways to discredit him from winning MVP. It was really interesting to watch the city burn from the outside, watching people fling arguments back and forth to why Proper should or should not win. There were some who even went to the point of saying he should not win because he's pocketed too much, which is why I brought this topic up when we talked about Sinatra and Jonak, and also Leave too. As you've seen with almost every MVP aside from Fleta, Jonak, Sinatra, Leave, and now Proper were pocketed because they're able to pull performances off like you're seeing right now. Give Proper the ball is a viable strategy. It's obviously not foolproof, but for 2022, with how everything shaped up, that was Shock's meta. Just let Proper play. He was able to play everything at a higher level than almost everyone around him, and looking rationally, no one else was going to win MVP aside from Proper. Hanbin is the only other scraping candidate since he was insane at Junker Queen and Zarya, but he also wasn't playing full-time in mid-season, essentially missing a stage out, where Proper still had his head in the game. At least in the DPS department, I don't think we've ever seen a person as impactful or reach the heights Proper did during 2022, maybe Ons in 2020, but that's the only other person I could think of. Shock actually took their main hitscan player Kilo, put him on the bench so Proper could take his roll-up. Of course, Kilo was not very good, but the simple fact Proper can take someone's job away is quite impressive, especially when he's not even known for being a hitscan player. Even his Widow was just unreal, which according to Avril talking with Ons during his time at the Overwatch Champion Series Asia LAN, Ons actually sat in a call with Proper and taught him how to play Widow during 2020, so I guess it explains why he's so good. The Widow Master teaches his son. Proper almost carried Shock to another ring in 2022 because of how good he was at Sojourn, putting up performances better than most people who were actually hitscan players, while also carrying a bum Winston. He is the first and only person to get Roll Star, Rookie of the Year, and MVP in the same season, and it's impressive to see how much he was able to do that year, which honestly, these performances should not even have been possible. Our final MVP for 2023 was someone, the tank player for Florida Mayhem, where we fall into a similar Fleta situation. Someone was not the best at anything, but he was so good at everything, it gave him the edge to let Florida have a ton of success in 2023. Originally being known as a main tank, but apparently his understanding of Overwatch is so high he's able to play whatever you need. There's of course a few heroes we never really saw him on, like Ball for example, but I'm sure he could pick it up quite easily. His flexibility allowed Florida to play essentially any team comp and counter swap on the fly, which is something not many teams or players could do. Even the best players have their hero pools you want them to be on, especially when you're talking about tanks. If you take Fearless and Hanbin, for example, one of the best tank lines of all time, they needed to be together so they could complement each other's weaknesses. Hanbin Winston during 2023 was not very good. Fearless was alright on the off tanks, but when he played it, it was clearly weaker than his actual role. You want him to be on main tanks. Houston signed Bernard for 2023 playoffs for a reason. When signing Fearless as a solo tank, you're kind of banking on forcing Winston or Doom all season, which obviously ended up working out for them because Winston was hard meta. If you look at Dallas, they were struggling quite heavily on maps that required Winston to be played during the spring stage. Then as he fell out of the APAC meta during summer stage, Dallas immediately improved since Hanbin didn't need to play that hero anymore and he could actually play the things he's good at. But when you have Hanbin and Fearless together, you can put in Hanbin, one of the best off tanks of all time, if those heroes are needed, and if you need Winston, well, you have one of the best of all time in Fearless. Someone is essentially both of these players mixed together if you removed 30% of their talent. He added a strength of having confidence in him regardless of his picks. Winston, Queen, Doom, Sigma, Rhine, whatever it was, in a game with one tank, that's quite a valuable man right there. Also being able to build the intangibles with his teammates as well, since the tank remains consistent, his team doesn't need to make adaptations for a different style. Someone, of course, never reached the heights of Fearless or Hanbin in peak individual performances, but he doesn't really need to. The guy can play his game and fit in perfectly. If Florida needed to swap comps, just walk back to spawn and change. There was also a sense of uncertainty for the opposition of someone, since if a team has two tanks and a certain player ever gets subbed in, you can assume what they'll play. Like if Fearless came in, for example, you know he's going to play Winston or Doom, but someone tosses a curveball right into that mindset because he can play everything and never needs to be taken out. 2023's MVP was a 50-50 between someone and Lip, mainly due to Lip being able to play Sombra for the first half. His Sombra is unreal, so it makes sense. Atlanta dominated the first half, and Florida dominated the second half, so this is where that thought experiment comes in, whether you believe an MVP is the player who had the highest peak on all the heroes they needed to play, or how much you value flexibility in a role, since someone could play every tank in the book. 2023's MVP competition was literally decided based on these two philosophies, so which is more valuable? Regardless of who won MVP, they both deserved it. Now we will go into the hardest part of the video, ranking all of these bastards. This probably is the most difficult ranking of all time. I think I rearranged it 7 to 8 times, but now I should be happy with this one, I hope. I tried my best to rank them between them deserving MVP and also how good their season was in comparison to the others. I'll have a link to the tier list in the description if you'd like to use the template for whatever reason. The bottom MVP is Fleta. Even though he is one of my favorite players, I still think his MVP is the weakest out of all 6. Of course, Fleta has the flexibility, exceptionally good at Tracer and Echo, also capable of playing hitscan to an alright level. He was one of the original Hyperflex players, but I sat and asked myself, like, how integral was Fleta for Shanghai's success in 2020? He was obviously doing his job well enough to get MVP, but would losing Fleta truly hurt the Dragons? I mean, probably not that much unless there is some sort of intangible no one knows about. You could argue in some cases a more aggressive or mechanically skilled player would actually have made the team better. If you look at 2020 Summer Showdown, the Genji needed to be a mechanical warlord, being able to individually carry fights, which is why teams like Paris, Philadelphia Fusion, and Guangzhou were successful. Sparkle, EQO, and Eileen's Genjis were insane. Shanghai did make the finals, of course, because this roster was stacked, but Fleta couldn't succeed in a position like that due to his more reactive playstyle. During this season, I voted for Void as MVP, since I felt if you lost him as an off-tank, him not being there would have made Shanghai noticeably worse. But honestly, it's not like viewer votes count for shit, we can just make pretend that they do. All of the other MVPs ahead of Fleta were just more integral to their team's success during their respective years. This of course does not mean Fleta is bad, you can't win MVP and be awful, but stacking him against the other players here, it's hard to say Fleta MVP is the end-all be-all of this conversation. All of the MVPs from now on are ones who, if they were not on the roster, it would genuinely hurt the hell out of their team, at least for some portions of the year. In the case of our number 5, which is Sinatra, the best Zarya during GOATS, and probably best Doom during 2019, imperative to the Shock success in the earlier stages. My only issue with Sinatra versus the rest going forward was his stage 4. GOATS was not the whole year, and Doom was mainly used during playoffs, which technically doesn't count for MVP since that's regular season only. His actual DPS play was just fine during stage 4. As I said earlier, the discernible difference between Sinatra, Zarya, and Doom versus his other DPS was quite noticeable and does take some points off since you can't pretend an entire stage did not happen. Shock was obviously fantastic during stage 4 because it was the 2019 Shock, but you can't attribute the stage 4 breeze of, oh yeah, Sinatra was the reason this happened. He was there slaughtering the village, like you could with him playing Zarya in stages 1 through 3. In 4, he was just there doing his job when he actually got playtime, which is good in the grand scheme of things, but with how competitive this list is and how hard placing everyone can be, smaller things like this need to be taken into account. If he was pounding everyone into oblivion even in stage 4 and never got subbed out, then it's possible for him to be higher. But in reality, Sinatra could have rode the bench for the whole stage more than he already did, and results would have been exactly the same. He wasn't elevating everyone like he was during the GOAT stages. The next spot is someone, the most valuable tank currently. As we said with his rundown, being able to swap to anything at any time is a pocket strategy not many teams had the option to do. Most of Florida's success came from them being able to do this, walk out, see what the other team is playing, run back to spawn, and change the comp accordingly to make the opposing team be in an uncomfortable position. It seems the value of being able to do this is undermined by a lot of people. Someone didn't need to be the best at anything, but he added a similar value to a person who was the best at specific heroes. If someone was removed from Florida Mayhem, the team would have been in a much worse position. Most of the strategies this team had revolved around him. If this was during Overwatch 1, it wouldn't be as amazing or impactful for that matter, but in a game with one tank, it's impressive and more than valuable for any roster. Making strategies around someone clearly worked. Florida pounded the second half of 2023 and still a top team in the first half. And honestly, if Florida dominated that whole year, we'd be putting someone at 2 or 3, but I still attribute most of this team's success on the back of him, regardless of how long their dominance commenced. Jonak is the fucking man, and I decided to put him at 3rd. For 2018 standards, he truly was on a different plane when it came to playing Zen. There actually was not a single person who was close to him during this period. Many people tried, but many failed. NYXL deciding to pocket him was a very unexpected strategy. I mean, sure, Zen needs peeling and protection because he's so susceptible to flankers, but the peeling he got was to levels never before seen, and it seemed to be NYXL's win condition. Instead of trying to win a fight or cap a point, instead it was make sure Jonak does not die, which was obviously for a reason. This guy was having top level damage statistics consistently throughout the year. In stages 1 through 4, this roster was wildly successful from their playstyle around making sure Jonak gets value. Even when they weren't pocketing him, Jonak was still getting unreal amounts of value. His mechanical skill on Zen is unbelievable. Sure, it's only one hero he's truly known for, but that's all he needed to play. His other flex supports were of course still fantastic, being a pivotal reason to NYXL's stage wins and entire season success. A support player being in the MVP conversation is quite difficult, and only the true best have been there, like Violet in 2020 and Shu during 2021, but Jonak actually managed to win the award. It was 100% deserved, and watching these matches back is a lot of fun to see how he played and got away with murder most of the time. Jonak will forever be remembered for what he did to society in 2018. Our number 2 MVP is Leave, able to field anything you require, and most of the heroes he plays are at the pinnacle level. It's not like Fleta, where he was just good at everything, with Tracer and Echo being his big two. Leave brought Hyperflex to a whole new conversation. He was one of those new generation DPS players, where he can play literally everything better than most, which only became more apparent with time. His DPS partner's weaknesses were obviously not ideal for Leave to play all the heroes he's good with, but it sort of forced him into a position to become the best version of himself and learn to be good with everything. As we said earlier with the Chengdu narrative, it was overblown quite heavily. These guys ended the season 3rd overall seed, but it is a fact Leave's team was not the greatest players to ever touch the game, and most could be replaced by someone else to upgrade this roster aside from a select few. And if you look at every other MVP, they were surrounded by warlords for the most part. Jonak, Sinatra, Fleta, Proper, Someone, they all had unreal players around them. Sure, there might be a stinker or two amongst them, but when you look at 2021 Chengdu, we got Taro Cookie, Kaneki, Jinmu the Pharah King, Elsa was fine, Nisha was alright. This was before Farway made a name for himself, and same with Jimmy. During this season, the only players on this roster that were considered good, and not even the best in the world, by the way, was Gaga. He was pretty good. Late Young, Leave, Monk, and Eviltal. Jinmu performed really well, but it's mainly because he got to play Pharah for so long. I think 2 of the stages that year Pharah was played, the Summer Showdown and the Countdown Cup. So imagine if he couldn't play that hero, how would this team have done if it was just Leave as the sole DPS player doing all the carrying? If you compare this roster to all the other MVPs that were surrounded by Lip, Void, Fearless, Izayaki, Choyobin, Striker, Violet, Moth, Mono, Libero, Peak Sabiolbi, you start to realize, like, what the fuck? The disparity between everyone else's team and Leave's team is quite jarring. But Leave still got MVP. His impact was unreal. It's a much more difficult task to win MVP when you look at it from that perspective. I hold this MVP higher because I feel like it was much harder for him to win versus all the other players who were surrounded by what a lot of people call the GOATs of this game. The number 1 MVP is Proper. The clips just speak for themselves, honestly. Proper's performances are probably the highest peak this game has ever seen. I don't think a player has ever been better than everyone else the instant they start playing a hero, or going toe-to-toe with the absolute best right away, or even steal someone's job as a hitscan player because you are just better. I do understand why people got sick of him. Obviously, it gets annoying hearing about the same person day after day when you're watching a match, especially those moments where if like Kaluge kills everyone, then Proper gets one final blow and the casters start ejaculating over Proper's single kill. Like, I get it, but that doesn't remove his impact from this team. I don't think the Shock roster would have been anywhere close to as good without him. He added so much firepower, more so than every other MVP. He was like a trend out Leave, had the flexibility of Fleta, and macro-like cheats of Jonak. I know playoffs has nothing to do with MVP, but the sole fact he carried a bum-ass Winston like that, Proper did so much in those playoff matches with Sojourn, and throughout the entire season, there's not really much to elaborate on there. He's just Proper. That's my ranking of the MVPs from worst to best. It was a really hard list to make. I changed a few of the spots around numerous times aside from the number 6 and number 1. If you have a list for yourself, please make sure to leave that in the comments below and yell at others when they don't agree with you. Thank you for watching to the end. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check out the playlist on screen if you want to see more videos about professional Overwatch players. There's a couple there. Right now I think it has 19. I don't know. Maybe more when you see it. I honestly am not sure. I've made so many already.